Baby, you remember back in 8th grade when we did the play in our school, Bow Down.
Yes.
About the story of Esther?
It was great.
Yeah.
What was your role?
I was Haman.
And I was a dancer.
The thing about that you probably didn't realize is even when you were like desperately trying to get my attention and get me to fall in love with you, even all those years ago, you were learning something really important about marriage through the story of Esther.
I was. I didn't know it, but I was. Well, let's get into that today.
Before we get into today's episode, just wanted to remind you that in the description of the video below, we put links to all of our social media accounts.
You can always reach us with questions or comments about this episode at marriagebydesignpodcast@gmail.com.
And finally, if you want to support us financially, there is a link to be able to do so at the end of each of the descriptions of our videos. Now, let's get back to the show. Hey everybody, I'm Nathan Warnock.
I'm Andrea Warnock, and you've joined us for Marriage Monday on the Marriage by Design podcast. This is the time that we get to talk to you about God's design for marriage, what the Bible has to say about that, and then how we live that out practically.
That's right. So today, we're going to talk a little bit about the biblical book of Esther. It's 10 chapter book of the Bible, and if you've never heard the story of Esther, I'd encourage you, even if you go, I don't really do a ton of biblical reading, I'd encourage you to go check it out. It's in the Old Testament, kind of in the middle-ish of the Old Testament, and it's a story of a woman named Esther. And Andrea is going to share the kind of the synopsis of the story, and then we're going to talk a little bit about how in the world that applies to marriage. But I think the bad guy in that story is a guy named Haman, a guy I played, which was hard because I'm such a good guy. Like at heart, it was hard for me to play a bad guy. But I did back in 8th grade. So
for those who may not know, we went to elementary and junior high school together, and to a small Christian school. And yeah, our 8th grade music play thing was called Bow Down.
Right.
And we could probably still sing some of
the
songs from that. But
good. I know the punchline was old Haman got a new necktie.
That's funny.
So yeah, and we got married halfway through our 8th grade year.
Oh my gosh.
Which is why we've been married 18 years, even though we're only
right. That's how it worked. Yes.
7.
So Nathan was Haman, and I was a dancer because, of course, the story of Esther in the Bible had dancers, right?
That's right.
Yes. Okay.
Right. So
it was a musical.
Right. So, this story is really interesting, and if you've not read it, the book of Esther has only a distinction of being one of only 2 books in the Bible that the name of God is not mentioned a single time in the entirety of the book. And actually, we've done a series on this channel for the other book that does not mention God at any point. Can you think of what it is off the top of your head?
Ruth?
No?
No, because that says your God will be my God.
We did a long-form series that talked quite a bit about
Song of
sex.
Solomon.
Song of Solomon,
course,
that's it.
yes.
That's right. Song of Solomon also does not mention the name of God throughout it. So Esther and Song of Solomon. The point in Esther is, despite not overtly talking about God, one of the big points of the book is how clearly God is working in the circumstances surrounding Esther. So, babe, why don't you give us like the 2, 3, 4, 5 minute synopsis of Esther, and then we'll talk a little bit about how this relates to marriage.
Okay, I'll try. So Esther starts out with this king
Xerxes.
Well, Xerxes, but did you know that means king headache? Anyway, that's what I learned a long time ago.
He was a headache.
So King Xerxes, he was the king of Persia, and he had a wife named Vashti, and he was not a godly man. Anyway, he was the book opens up with he was having this huge celebration. It was like 100 and some odd days to just show how powerful he was.
Yeah.
And at the end of this celebration, he summoned his wife to kind of just show her off.
Vashti. Yep.
His wife Vashti, yes. The queen, to kind of just show her off. And she said no. And you don't tell the king no.
Right.
And so he ended up.
The implication being, because he says in there he wanted her to wear her crown. The implication being potentially only her crown.
Well, obviously,
and
whatever it
no.
was, she did not want to be shown off.
Right.
And so that was not okay. And she was no longer the queen.
That's right. Yeah, hilariously, his people tell him, like, hey, if you don't do something about this, wives are not going to be listening to their husbands throughout the entirety of the land, right? Which you still hear that ridiculous argument at times, even now.
So when she was not the queen anymore, he decided to have this beauty pageant to kind of find his new wife.
America's Next Top Model.
That was it. So he had many virgins to come in, and they were given all these beauty treatments and all that sort of thing, and kind of paraded in front of him.
Yep.
And during that time, we find out there's this guy named Mordecai who's a Jew, and there's this section. There's this I don't know how many at the time. I guess the number of Jews who were living in Persia at the time who had not gone back to Jerusalem. Some had, but
most had not.
But they had not gone back to Jerusalem, so they were living in Persia.
Yep.
And there's this guy, Mordecai, who was a Jew, loved the Lord, and he was raising his niece, Esther. Or cousin, right?
I believe that's right.
Cousin. He was raising his cousin, Esther. Anyway, so Esther goes into this beauty pageant thing. She ends up winning. That sounds so weird. The king is completely taken by her, and he ends up choosing her and ends up making her the queen.
Right.
So there's this Jew that's now the queen of Persia. And then the king has this kind of right-hand man named Haman, and decides to make him the second most important man in all the land, and gives him a really high honor. So kind of all that is going on. And then Mordecai, through, again, Esther's cousin, through some random set of circumstances, hears two government officials say they were plotting to kill the king. So he tells whoever he told, and the king's life was saved.
Right.
And that was written down in the history books, and kind of that was it.
Remember that.
Yep. We'll come back to that. So then this guy, Haman, somehow convinced the king that, I don't remember the exact details. That's terrible. I read the story earlier today, but I don't have the mind like Nathan. So he convinced the king that everyone should have to bow down to Haman when they saw him.
Out of respect for the king.
Right. So the king says, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Let's do that. So that was the decree. And then at some point, Mordecai doesn't bow down to Haman. Haman gets really angry, and Haman then goes to the king and says, and a decree ends up being written that all the Jews will be killed, and they kind of roll a dice, sort of a thing, and say, well, it's going to be in 11 months.
Yeah, that's important. That roll, the casting of lots.
Right.
Yeah.
It was sort of this superstitious thing that happened, and the lots, rolling the dice, casting lots, decided it would be in 11 months that the Jews would be killed.
Right. It was like the purge. It was like it was March 7th, I think.
Right.
In our calendar days.
So Esther is a Jew. The king does not know that, though, by the way. The king does not know that
Mordecai told her to keep it secret.
Is a Jew. Yep. So Mordecai and Esther talk, and they're both afraid of this decree, and Mordecai tells her, you should talk to the king about this. And at the time, the way this worked is that you never approached the king unless you were asked to, unless you were summoned by the king. Like, you did not say, I want to talk to you, so let's talk. That's not the way it works. She was only supposed to come to the king when she was summoned.
Those are the days, am I right?
What are you talking about?
Totally kidding.
So Mordecai was telling her, well, you should talk to the king. But he also makes a very clear distinction, and this what faith he had, but if you don't, God will find another way to save the Jews.
Right.
And so he knew that God would prevail.
Yeah, he says a really poignant passage to her that we should revisit on like a bonus Family Friday or something.
Yeah, so he's kind of talking to her about you should go to the king, but if you don't, God will find another way to save the Jews. And but who knows that maybe it's such a time as this. You were born for such a time as this. Like maybe this is maybe God has put you in this position and used you for this time to save the Jews.
Right.
So that is a big thing that he says, for such a time as this.
Right.
So she ends up deciding, yes, she's going to take a risk and ask to meet with the king. So she asks the king and Haman if they will have a banquet with her.
She goes into the court.
Yeah.
Right. And this is the moment where she could be killed
because she's approaching the king without being summoned.
Right. If he didn't extend his scepter to her, which he does.
Yep.
And her request is what?
Have a banquet with me and Haman.
She knows. Best way to a man's heart, right through the stomach.
Yeah. So they have a banquet, and she doesn't, probably because she was being prompted by the Lord, she doesn't say anything. They just have a banquet. But at that banquet, she asks them the next night to come to a banquet of, a special banquet again.
Yeah. Side note, ladies, guys like a good mystery and a woman of mystery, and she really baits these guys up.
Yeah.
Because he starts when she first shows up by saying he's really taken with her, and he says,
really
"Hey, I'll
do anything.
I'll give you anything up to half the kingdom," which was like king parlance at the time for "I'll do anything for you," and she just simply says, "Come to dinner with me." And so they come to dinner, and he asks her again, "What can I do?" And she says, "All I want is for you to come to another banquet with me, the three of you, just her, Xerxes, and Haman, the following day." And she tells him, "And then I'll tell you what it is that I want." These guys they're baited up.
So that night,
so tell the part about Haman. How does Haman react to this being invited to these banquets?
Oh, he thinks he's
the stuff.
Yes. Like he's been invited to a banquet with the queen, the king, and himself, and that's all. Those are the important people.
Right.
We have all the important people in the room.
Right. So he walks out of the banquet to go home. And who's standing there not bowing?
Mordecai.
And so now he's immediately furious again.
So angry. And so he builds a gallows not a gallows, a impaling stick.
Yeah. So if you read the story, they call it a gallows, right? Is what they call it. But it's not. We think of a gallows as like rope,
chop your head
like
off.
the old, Western, like
I'm thinking guillotine.
Hang you from a rope. But the gallows back then, and this is actually kind of interesting, in Persia was just a stake that they would put straight up, and they would put you over it, and then they would drop you.
I'm done.
And you would go sliding down this until friction stopped you, and there you would sit until you died. Now, for those of you who know the Bible, you may be going, man, in some ways that sounds kind of like the cross. You're exactly right. In fact, the Romans took the idea of the gallows from the Persians and the Assyrians before them and sort of civilized it into the idea of the cross, which is what Jesus ultimately would be hung on.
Moving on. So he built this in his backyard. For Mordecai, right? Yeah. And
5 stories high.
Yeah.
Yikes.
That night also the king couldn't sleep, and so he didn't have Facebook to scroll through. So he asked kind of an orator to come in and read him some history.
Yeah, which I suppose is a good way to go to sleep.
Right. He just wanted, so wouldn't you know, the history that he was reading about was about when Mordecai thwarted the plan of these 2 government officials to kill the king.
Yep.
And the king asks, well, did we ever honor him? Was there anything ever done? And no, there wasn't anything ever done for him. So he's like, oh my goodness, well, we need to honor him. And so he
rushes out to the court,
going out to the court,
to find
the
someone,
courtyard.
because Xerxes, I'm not sure how much was going on upstairs with him, because he makes a lot of questionable decisions. But he runs out to the court to ask someone, well, what should I do?
Right.
And who do you suppose is there?
Haman.
So
he asks Haman, what would you do for somebody that I want to honor? And you have the exact words, but tell me what you would do for somebody that I want to really honor.
Right. So in chapter 6, verse 4, so the king said, "Who is in the court?" Now Haman had just entered the outer court of the king's palace to suggest that the king hang Mordecai on the gallows he had prepared for him. The king's servants said to him, "Haman is there, standing in the court." And the king said, "Let him come in." So Haman came in, and the king asked him, "What shall be done for the man whom the king delights to honor?" Now Haman thought in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" And Haman answered the king, and then he goes on to describe this big, give him your robe and give him your crown and put him on your horse.
And parade him through the city,
exactly,
saying, "This is the man the king wants to honor."
Right.
So he's come up with this elaborate plan because surely the only person that the king would want to honor is him,
right.
Haman.
Right.
So the king says, "That's great. Do that to Mordecai." You parade him around on the horse and all that. And
brutal.
And
which he does.
He does. So Mordecai gets paraded around. That's his reward for keeping the king from getting killed.
Right.
And I'm sure that makes Haman's anger for Mordecai burn even more.
No question.
Okay, so then we have this next night of the banquet, and the queen has Haman and the king there, and she ends up telling the king, "I'm a Jew," and Haman has decreed, and well, the two of you have decreed to kill all the Jews. And the king is completely distraught.
Yep.
And angry.
Mm-hmm.
And he ends up leaving in anger.
Mm-hmm.
And
Haman realizes he's in big trouble.
Right. Haman realizes he's really screwed up. And so he kind of starts groveling at the queen, which I'm sure he should never even be very close to the queen in that time. He ends up groveling and like kind of being on top of her, like hands, like begging for his life.
Right. You can imagine him like holding on to like the hem of her dress or her, whatever. You can just imagine that.
Being too close to her.
Right.
And the king walks in. And he's like, "What the heck? Are you gonna have my queen too?" I don't know what he says exactly, but it's something
says
like,
"You're going to assault my queen while I'm in the palace."
Yeah. So then at that point, Haman is, he knows his life is ending because the eunuch like put a cloth over his head.
A hood over his head.
Guards,
Yep.
And which meant he was going to die.
Then a eunuch comes in with a suggestion. Do you remember this?
Yeah. Okay. So that's where the eunuch comes in. The eunuch comes in and was like, "Hey, so Haman just built a gallows in his backyard. Let's hang him on the gallows."
Yeah. I don't blame him. If I was a eunuch, I'd be trying to think of all kinds of ways to torture other people.
Sure. So Haman ends up getting hung on the gallows that he built for Mordecai in his own backyard.
Right. And in fact, all of Haman's property is transferred to Mordecai and Esther.
Yes. And then the way it worked back then is a decree could not be undone. And so the king ends up making a new decree that when it comes time for the Jews to be killed, they can defend themselves, and they do. And they end up actually killing a whole lot of Persians. So, so that's the story of Esther.
That's great, and I'd encourage you to read it. But man,
it's
you
a
did
really
great
story
of describing it. So how in the world could this possibly relate to marriage? And I think this really stood out to me as I've been studying Esther in my men's Bible study that I do. I read this passage, and I read it a second ago, but I want to read it one more time. Just the part of the end of verse 6, where in chapter 6, verse 6, where the king asks him, "Hey, what should I do to Mordecai?" And Haman says, and it's interesting how it says this. Now Haman thought in his heart, "Whom would the king delight to honor more than me?" That thought that Haman has there is the beginning of his undoing, because he's so self-absorbed that he can't imagine the king wanting to honor anyone but him. So he rolls out this extravagant. I mean, you can just imagine Haman for months ahead of time laying in his bed imagining the king putting a robe on him, all these things, because he just comes up with it off the top of his head, which he's been thinking about this for who the heck knows how long. Says it. The king says, okay, do this to your enemy, who the king doesn't know is his enemy, but do this to your enemy, and it solidifies Haman in his hate for Mordecai such that he's completely blinded to the reality of the situation around him. Mm-hmm. To the extent that even after he parades Mordecai around, he goes home and his wife and family who helped him and encouraged him to build this gallows in his backyard said, look, don't do this. You can't prevail against Mordecai. And he blew off their advice, kept doing it anyway, and it ultimately leads to his destruction. Mm-hmm. And I thought, in all these couples that you and I have been blessed to have an opportunity to sit and chat with, how many times, babe, have you sat back and went, man, that thing you just said is super selfish, like super self-absorbed. And of course, you can't always say that to someone, but my point and my encouragement for our listeners for this particular episode is, man, be really careful about that selfish desire that we can all have creep up inside of us, because you lose a grasp on the reality of the situation when you give yourself over to selfishness, because your spouse is never going to treat you the way that you think you ought to be treated in your selfish state.
Right.
Because it's just selfish nature that, like Haman, well, this can only be about me. And our marriages can become that. Well, this marriage is really like, I'd do all the stuff she wants me to do if she would just do A, B, C, D, F, G, A, blah, 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 right? And pretty soon it becomes completely about me. And even if it doesn't start that way, like oftentimes I understand it doesn't start that way. It starts with like, have some actual concerns. And that's fine. Like totally, it's two people living together in marriage. Paul makes it clear if you get married, you will have trouble. So it's not that selfishness is the cause of every rocky bump in a marriage, but man, is it easy and always tempting for us as husband or wife to go down that road of what I deserve in marriage. Do you think?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I think that's oftentimes what creeps up the most in marriage is just our own selfishness.
Yeah, it can look a lot of ways, right? But I would encourage you, and this is really what I would love to accomplish with this episode. If you're listening to this episode, here's what I want you to really focus on. I want you to just put an alarm bell in the back of your head. If you can create that right now, this little alarm bell that goes off every time you think, well, if for me, right? Anytime you have that thought of, hey, I would do this thing if she would do for me, right? What can I do to get her to do blank for me? Mm-hmm. Anything that starts with the focus on the other person, meaning what you deserve, is pretty much immediately I want that alarm bell to go off. And I'm not even saying that those things are necessarily wrong, because I do think it's important as husband and wife for us to have honest conversations about, like, hey, it really hurts me that you do this, or it really hurts me that you don't do this. Those are real conversations, but I also don't think that's maybe really what we're talking about, because it seems like the heart oftentimes in that conversation is, I want our marriage to be mutually fulfilling.
Are you focused on yourself or are you focused on the relationship?
Yeah.
So I think that's and you have to be honest about that, because you can be focusing on yourself and saying, oh, but it's about the relationship,
Right.
you know? So am I focused on these things because it would make me life easier? It would make me, it's me. Or is it, hey, this would really improve our relationship, but I'm not changing my service towards you or my love towards you or respect towards you.
Yep.
But I would like these things, and I think this would improve our relationship.
Right.
So the selfish part comes in with, are you holding back? Like, are you holding back until you get what you want? Or are you continuing to be the godly spouse that you're called to be, even when you don't get what you want?
Yeah, that's well put. Really, really well put. And it's like Haman. The danger here is, and we've known tragically a number of marriages that are going down in flames to destruction, much like Haman's life, and the people they can't even get over themselves long enough to realize that they're contributing to the fire.
Yeah.
And man, that makes me so sad when you talk to people who are like, well, we're getting a divorce. Well, man, can we help? Like, that's terrible. Can we help put it? Well, if you can change her. Well, I'm immediately annoyed.
There is
in
a
that
distinction
situation.
in the relationships that the people that we get to talk to in relationships. So often the ones that end up moving towards divorce are because both of them are focused on the other person and not on what they need to do.
Meaning focused on themselves from the standpoint of, I don't have any issues. It's that person.
Yeah,
that
it's
has
like
issues.
this person, if they would change, then our marriage would be great. I don't
Right.
need to change. It's the other person.
Right.
But the people who reconcile and God builds something new and all that are focused on the other person, because that's the reality. But they don't miss but there's things God wants to do in my life for our marriage, like God, that the Lord wants to change in me, and I'm willing to let God change
Right.
those things,
Right. That's
Yeah.
good. Really good. Other takeaways from Esther, maybe unrelated to the selfishness point, but
Man, there's so many things in Esther, but I love a couple things. That line that Mordecai says, God will make this happen. Him saying, like, maybe it's through you, Esther, or maybe it's a different way, but God will prevail. And I think so often we get so wrapped up in, how can I make this thing work? Whatever it is, this thing that you want, or this thing that you need to happen, this thing that's godly, whatever. How do I make this happen? And we forget that the Lord is in control, and we need to just open our hands to his control, right?
Yep.
And just
Great
allow
call.
him to move. And maybe the plans I have, maybe the steps I made for that are the right steps, or maybe God has a completely different plan.
Right.
And I need to step out of the way maybe for that, or step into what he's asking me to. And so I can get so distracted by, I need this to happen, and I don't see how this is going to happen. I mean, when Nathan and I were going through the massive struggle we had in our marriage in 2012, I remember really being tempted to think, I don't know how this would ever work out. I can't see it. But yet I did trust the Lord, but I just didn't see, like, I don't know how this can ever work. And what if I do this? And what if I do this? And I would be convicted with that. Like, you don't need to work. God needs to work. But I really love that. Like, God's plan will prevail, and we need to be open to his control on that.
That's right.
And then the other part of where Mordecai says to Esther, again, I don't know the exact words, but do you have them?
Yep, 14.
So, for if you remain completely silent, he's talking to Esther. For if you remain completely silent at this time, Relief and deliverance will arise for the Jews from another place, but you and your father's house will perish. Yet who knows whether you have come to the kingdom for such a time as this? And he's saying, yeah, who knows? Maybe you are queen for this very reason. And I think that applies to everyone's life. You have a purpose and a plan, and God's going to call you into things that you may be saying, maybe this is why I'm here for such a time as this. And really just allowing, even in the scary times, for God to work in our lives in ways that we could never even see that working out. But God's in control.
Couldn't have said it better, babe. That's really good. Thanks for sharing that. Well, guys, I hope that you've had an opportunity to maybe convince yourself to take another look at the book of Esther, at the very least, to kind of set that alarm in the back of your mind about those areas in your marriage and your relationship where you're being selfish, that you not ride that selfishness into destruction of your marriage. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate you being here. Hope that you have an excellent week. We look forward to seeing you next week right here on the Marriage by Design channel. Remember, God is for your marriage.